to overhauling the third level elections to the third level panels in Shannon for the next election or whenever. That of itself is a big, massive registration task that some of the resistance to would be, well, how would you go about doing that? If we had developed in a freestanding electoral commission the expertise and the experience to say that could be added to and added value. So what I'm saying is that although your recommendations, of course, are made at a moment in time, they have to have regard to the fact that whereas we once had a fairly solid 2.5-party system with traditional loyalties, that has all loosened up, as has all of the communications, as has even the demographics about where people live and how they're registered. And I think that an electoral commission with the proper skill set, with a more diverse skill set, would be well positioned to chart those choppy waters better.
Thank you. Mr. Whelan. Deputy McLaughlin.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. You're very welcome. Just a couple of questions there. First of all, I suppose this is the third meeting we've had, I think, Chairman, in relation to talking about the setting up of the Electoral Commission. I suppose one of the issues that has certainly, and I know you've mentioned it there, in relation to the amount of abuses that are taking place over the years in relation to registration and this type of thing, that perhaps maybe the PPS number is the answer, and I think that it seems to be coming out loud and clear. But only last week I met a group from USI, and just to listen to their input, I mean, they registered 28,000 students recently for the recent marriage equality referendum, and they mentioned there about checktheregister.ie, very slow to update. You know, these are people that have just come on the register. These are people that are representing 300,000 students across the island of Ireland, and these are some of the issues that they were concerned about. That you mentioned, some of the speakers mentioned there about undertaken by local authorities, each local authority being responsible for their own register. Is that outdated at this stage, or is that the way forward in relation to getting people on the register? As we knew in the past, you had the rate collector who was in an operation in every area of the county. That has ceased now, and I'm just wondering, to get people actually on the register, because I see it at each election, and only recently during the referendum as well, people clamouring to get on the register it was actually the supplementary register. Now, the abuses that I raised it here last week in relation to the supplementary register in the past at the last local elections, you have people put on the supplementary register whereby they're not even resident in this country. They were on the register and they were living in Australia, in Canada, America, and various other places. And these are the things that certainly need to be sorted out. In relation to the boundary changes, you mentioned to keep it perhaps maybe from the recommendations of the Electoral Commission. I'm just wondering how or who would be responsible, because I see in my own constituency there where boundary changes now have been introduced, whereby 4 counties are both Sligo, Leitrim, Cavan, and Donegal in the one constituency. And I'd just like to hear perhaps maybe some of your comments on those. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy McLaughlin. Deputy Fleming.
Very quickly, and thanks for your comment about updating the register and check the register. It's quite right. The difficulty at the moment with all the local authorities doing it individually is there's no what I call real-time register or live register. So you can send in your name to the local authority today, but your name won't appear until the draft register next November. So if you inquire next month, you're still not on it, and if you inquire the following month, you're still not on it, even though you've sent in your form. Like, there's no public body operating that way anymore, that if you send in your thing, even if it's for a bad system like the medical card, after 3 days they will have your application up, right? So when a person sends in a form now to update whether it's a supplement, they won't know until the hard copy actually comes out within the week before polling day. So there is need for a centralised live system, so you can know within maybe on the minute, or certainly the following day that your name is actually up there. So that's very important. The issues you mentioned about people going on the register for the recent local elections that weren't in the country, I had thought that had tightened up, because to get on the supplement register now for the last couple of years, a guard has to stamp the form. And like, perhaps local authority members or local authorities who were taking in the forms from people perhaps whom they knew through the work in the local authorities, maybe were a little bit lenient on that. But that should be easily verified. And I've seen local authorities coming back to that issue after an election, when several people called to a house and knew there was no one there, but knew there was 10 people on the register from that address. And those matters were investigated by the local authority afterward. Maybe no prosecution followed, but I think there are lessons to be learned. On the boundary changes, the only reason I say it should be kept separate, and people will have different views on this, I would be concerned with the people who are working on the administering of the elections on an ongoing basis, would be involved some way in drawing up the boundaries, because personal convenience, administrative convenience would come into the equation far too much. And I do believe the system we have has a lot of difficulties, and the biggest difficulty we have is the change in population, and people don't like it. There are more Polish people in Ireland than there are Leitrim people. You know, and that's a brutal statement, but it's a simple fact, and there's nearly more Polish people in Laois than there are Leitrim people in Leitrim. So I can understand the county feeling the right and the entitlement, because of a geographic county boundary, to be part of a unique voting system or a unique constituency. But if we're to count people rather than county boundaries, some of that is going to happen. I don't have the answer to your problem. I know you have 4 constituencies in that new area up there, and to me, that sounds wrong, because people should have an association with whoever they're electing, and there was probably a better way of doing it. You might have had to combine 2, which you didn't need to combine 4. So, in other words, I share your concern on that one, and I don't have the answer to that one. We're not going to do that, right?
Mr. O'Keefe.
Chairman, on voter registration, I fought 9 general elections, and I suppose every single, well, that, I still came across what I think is probably one of the most frustrating things for any politician or aspiring politician, and certainly very frustrating for voters or prospective voters who found they weren't on the register. I've come across all sorts of situations where people have been on the register for yonks, and then find themselves in a particular election, their name is taken off and they didn't even know it, no notification. I've seen double registrations. I found myself, my own name, registered here in Dublin without my knowledge, approval or consent, while obviously my voting centre of attention was voting in West Cork. So, I mean, that really has to be sorted out. I think the views that are being expressed, particularly by practising politicians, are very helpful to the debate. But in the end of the day, I suppose one of the first jobs the Electoral Commission will have to do is to address this issue and take on board all the various views that are being expressed, do some further research if necessary. And I think both Norwil and myself agree, you don't throw out the expertise that's already there amongst I think it's 31 separate local authorities that are there at the moment on the part of what they have to date, or indeed the expertise of local sheriffs, of returning officers and so on. But you gradually phase in their information for the establishment of a national database. And that can only be done by some surefire voter identification, individual identification system. Now, PPS, I suppose, at the moment appears to be the obvious one. But there are data protection issues. But I say, look, if you put in the appropriate safeguards, you just include in the legislation a statutory provision to enable them to use those. Now, I think it's Deputy Fleming mentioned that there may be more, one of your committee mentioned there may be advances as we go along. I mean, I know they're proposing the Department of Social Protection for a new public services card, and that may be something that could be used, and so on. But ultimately, we have to use whatever best system is there including possibly indeed the new postal code system. But it'll be up to the Electoral Commission to do that, bearing in mind all the frustration and all the problems that have been associated in the past. One of the issues I think that was raised was that PPS numbers are supposed to be 6.5 million. PPS number is an issue which is slightly more than the population base. So that will obviously, but you have to be careful of that. And the boundary changes, I still adhere to my view that the Electoral Commission should handle that. I think on an ongoing basis, what we have at the moment is they're just set up as an ad hoc boundary commission. It's much the same with a judge and the clerks and so on and so forth. And they do it on a one-off basis, then they're dissolved again. I would think that a continuing role looking at the changes that might be desirable and made would be a better way. And I think the Electoral Commission will be the answer to that. Look, I take the point made by Deputy Fleming that some of the people, the officials involved in the Election Commission might be keen to take the easy way out, but I'd have a higher opinion of such officials, having worked with them now, I say, recently, and our people at similar type business in Sidewell. But in the end of the day, it should be the members of the Commission and satisfaction that the members of the Commission would be making the final decisions. And I would say that point raised by Deputy Fleming could be covered. So that's my view on those two issues.
Thank you. I think one of the issues, there are two issues around the electoral register. One is the failure of the county councils to engage adequately with each other, particularly in Dublin. So it's scarily now about 28 years ago since I came to college in UCD. I stayed year 1 in Diggs and Ballantyre. I registered in Dublin South. I moved year 2 into Ranelagh. I registered in Dublin City area, but they never took me off in Dublin South. I stayed year 3 in Blackrock, which is Dunleary County Council area, but they never took me off in Ranelagh or Ballantyre, and my father, being a councillor, made sure I stayed on in Wexford as well. So in theory, at least, I was recorded each election of not having voted 3 times, which is why it affects the turnout as well. And that was in the, the mid-80s, which was a lot less volatile in terms of demographic shifts than what happened in the 80s and 90s. PPS number is ultimately the answer, and I think we can get to that system. But here's the other issue, is that there used to be a pattern of an active campaign every October or thereabouts to put new people on the register or put people on the register at new addresses. And what happened in the recent referendum was that the campaigning groups, and USI was campaigning on one side of it, I was involved in another one of them myself, reached out to get particularly the younger voters on the register. And they did it in innovative ways, like registration desks in the colleges, like online encouraging people to do it. Now, some of that became controversial because a guard has to certify the identity for the supplemental register. It wouldn't be controversial if the Electoral Commission itself was providing the same facilities, not requiring people to come to them to register, but reaching out to find and encourage people to register. And if that was done properly on an annual basis, there would be less need for people to be on the supplementary register, so the additional cumbersome process of identification wouldn't be there. I tilt towards Deputy Fleming's view, and you see in my own paper, that the electoral boundary should be done by a standalone, temporarily appointed boundary commission. There has, in fairness to boundary commissions, and like yourselves, I'm probably one of the few people who read the things over the years, but there have begun to develop a consistency, at least in terms of trying to identify big geographic areas that they can work with. I think the answer may be that the Electoral Commission would staff and support the Boundaries Commission when it's established, in the same way that the Secretary General of Environment, or the whatever it's now called, of Environment, is currently on the Boundaries Commission, and it is staffed by a principal officer or senior officer in the Department of the Environment, so that at least the corporate memory and material from election to election is brought forward, and that may be part of the solution. But again, I emphasise, one of the most controversial powers in any electoral system is the power to draw boundaries. It dominated for decades in Northern Ireland. One time here, the folklore was Kevin Boland, when he was Minister of Environment, used to send over to Mount Street for the best tallymen before he would draw the constituency maps. for the next election, and then we had controversy with Mander, which gave rise ultimately to the change of it. Again, it's a hard one. It was the first modernisation of our electoral system to give that to an independent commission, and I'd be careful about any shift with it. That's just the general point I would make.
And I take the point Jim O'Keefe raised about a permanent commission, but by and large, I think most people accept we do a census of population every 5 years, and we should only go changing boundaries based on hard facts, based on a census. I don't think it would be right to be changing it every year on a rolling basis. It should only be done on the basis of pure census facts. So by definition, the boundary issue only raises its head after each census. So they don't have work to do the other 4 to the 5 years in any event anyway. I just make that observation.
Deputy Coleman. Oh, sorry.
Thank you very much indeed, gentlemen. Just 2 questions there. You say the online voter registration. Do you see that as and I know that in the automatic voter registration as well, that has proved very in some countries, and I was just wondering what your comments would be on that, please.
First, a lot of systems have been very quick to adopt technology, the US being the most obvious one, and they have different electoral processes in each of the states. And in England, for example, I think 1 in every 10 voters in the recent election voted by post. But I have to say they've paid a price in compromising the perception of integrity about their electoral system. I'm not opposed to online registration. I just don't think the technology is there yet. There's some very interesting stuff in Maurice Manning's report with the working group on the Shannon about how you might at least create a system where people could print off a postal ballot paper once they had otherwise registered, and they consulted with some of the cybercrime units and stuff like that. So there is potential. I just don't think we're there yet, and I tend to err on the side when it comes to whether it's air traffic control or electoral systems. I go on the side of caution before technology on some of those type of systems.
Mr. O'Keefe.
Just one comment I'd say now from this comment is from somebody for whom technology wouldn't be my strongest suit. But I think essentially what we should be thinking of is raising all these issues, establish the Electoral Commission, have the Electoral Commission look at those issues, do the necessary research, see what, don't reinvent the wheel, see what the, as Noel Whelan mentions, what has been the experience in other jurisdictions, and then come up with new proposals. And that would be, I think, probably the best way forward. Certainly, our experience of rushing into a system like the e-voting did leave a few scars here and there, and I think a properly researched approach by an independent body like the Electoral Commission would be the way forward.
Finally, just the one remark I would make is, again, subject to data protection and using PPS numbers. Social welfare knows everybody who turns 18 every year or whenever they're coming off child benefit. That list should automatically be sent to the Electoral Commission, and each of those people should get the registration form. So you don't have the big hullabaloo as when elections come up, and it can run smoothly. The revenue exchange information with social protection every day of the week. Lots of government departments do it, subject to data control legislation, and the same could happen here. So I actually think that would probably get rid of some of the hiccups we're currently having, because it's been done manually and differently in different areas. So I think, things like that would help the smooth running of it.
Deputy Coleman.
First of all, thank you, gentlemen, for sharing your considerable wisdom with us, and we look forward to teasing out the advice that you've been given us. Some interesting points there, Chairman. I don't want to go back over them, but it struck me there when Noel Whelan was saying about in his days and his father putting people on the register. I think an interesting point, but one of the things I find that maddened people even more so was people who had been under arrest for a considerable time, and people like your father taking them off with it. I mean, that issue has to be addressed as well, because there's nothing as annoying as somebody who was there for 50 years of their life and suddenly they haven't died, they haven't gone away, as somebody else would say in politics, but yet they're not on the register come the day of the election. I was just wondering, I thought at the outset that both of you, or three of you, were saying that the boundary commission should be kept separate from the other commission that we're speaking about. But then I said from the electoral commission. But I noticed Jim is now rather coming down fairly heavy that there should be all the one and maybe subcommittees of it to deal with various things. But Noel again spoke about confidence in the electoral system, which is of the utmost important and a very valid point. But I know in the 3 elections that I stood in, there was up to 40,000 people who certainly don't have confidence in it. First of all, there was an area of South Tipperary brought into North Tipperary. Secondly, there was an area of South Offaly brought into North Tipperary. And now, at the moment, and you should talk to any of those people, if you talk about you think the Boundary Commission is doing its job right, the people from Lower Ormond and Nina and North Tipperary who now have gone into the Offaly constituency. And I think there should be more to a constituency than just the number of people as well, that we should look at the location, the size, the distance from one point to another. For example, in the New Tipperary constituency, to go from one end of it to another, you're talking about in excess of 75 miles. And it would be much easier. I think, it might be better if we were joined up with Tala or somewhere, at least to have the motorway to get up directly to it. So there are huge issues there to be dealt with. And I think the other thing is that people are sick and tired of various bodies, a commission for that, a body for this, and something else for the other. And if we are to make progress on it, we need to solidify all this and get it in under the one umbrella. Sean, you mentioned a very good point there, that 20,000 spoiled votes. But nobody from your group has mentioned the people who don't vote at all, and whether there should be an element of the Commission's function to be whether we deal with compulsive voting or whether that's a political issue. But I think in any election, in your constituency or in mine, the people who don't vote would certainly elect at least one member if they were all to turn out. And so, we need to address that problem as well. But again, establishing the register. I was just wondering across my mind, that when you were talking about how you deal with the register and the RSI numbers or PPS numbers or whatever, and there are so many people compiling registers now that should you not consider the experience that the revenue commissioners have, and indeed maybe add to that the ones that Irish Water has, and I'm sure that would bring joy to many people that if Irish Water had a role in compiling the register of today.
I'll begin again to Deputy Fleming and walk around.
Just very briefly, what Deputy Coonan is saying there is the upset boundary changes cause, and people need a sense of identity with their member of whoever they're electing to the Dáil, and the idea of somebody being a significant distance away from the area are not in what they would call their natural hinterland or natural county or even their province. Those are issues that probably the CSO figures just don't capture, and it's just numbers rather than people. So there is a fair point in that, and the terms of reference of a boundary commission can be more specific than they've been. They've tended to be specific about 3, 4 and 5 seats and protecting county boundaries insofar as possible and not breaching provincial boundaries. And and yet I think a way of dealing with some of that would be a more specific terms of reference on the boundary commission without it being party political, but taking those points into account. I just know in my own constituency, again, closeness to the polling station, we've done an analysis in our constituency, and those areas in the rural areas which would normally vote well, where there's a big area and they're far from a polling station, the townlands that are farthest from the polling stations have had historically some of the lowest turnout, because it might be a 16-mile round trip to get to the polling station, and people just don't bother. So that's a factor that needs to come into it as well. And Deputy Coonan is right, the people who don't vote, that's probably the big issue that maybe we've admitted here today. I'm not quite sure whose remit it is, but that's an issue. We can talk about voter registration, but then when they are registered, back to your Irish Water analogy, they might be registered but will they pay? They might register for an election but will they vote? So that's probably the big issue that needs to be dealt with, which I didn't deal with, and I accept that.
On the register, I take the points raised by Deputy Coonan. I'd say I wouldn't be rushing to introduce compulsory voting, and, at least initially at this stage. I think what we have to do is to have a system where anybody who wants to be registered can be registered easily, and will only be registered once where they are, and that it will be a proper system of registration, which clearly we haven't because of dispersed nature of what's there at the moment and other reasons. And then after that, we want to make sure that those who want to vote can vote. I agree again with Deputy on the point that I think that talked about frustrations of people involved in politics and frustration of people who wanted to vote, but the worst frustration I ever saw were people turning up at a polling station, having been on the register for all their life, and finding that without their knowledge, consent, approval or notification, they were off the register. And that I can certainly understand. That's total electoral frustration. Now, on the Boundary Commission, I also take the point raised about identity and distance and so on. My own view is that the central issue really, for me anyhow, wouldn't be distance. Or, as the Chairman will know, Cork South West is about 100 miles long, I think. And but yet there's a sense of identity in West Cork. West Cork is known sometimes as a 33rd county, so actually distance doesn't really matter too much. Bit awkward if you want to be servicing it, but that's another day's work. The biggest frustration I found in that regard, back along over the years, it goes back a good bit now, was when a chunk of the western area in Beara was actually transferred into South Kerry, and that caused a lot more frustration at the time. So I would see identity is possible, but if you are going for a PR system where you must have you can't go down to, you know, one seat or something like that. Yeah, there isn't a total solution, but I'd say in the main, my view on that is, insofar as possible, identity, whether it is like West Cork identity or a county identity, should be given very high consideration in the establishment of constituency boundaries.
Before I call on Noel, I'm just going to add to that there, Jim. The two elections you referred to there were 1973 and 77, where they took the Beara Peninsula, Castleton Beara, and put it into Kerry. Now, for religious purposes, it's the Diocese of Kerry, but you had people in Beara Island who were then voting to elect TDs up as far as between Killarney and Tralee. It made no sense. In my experience, the Boundary Commission, I accept its independence and it does a job fairly well, but I've made submissions to the Commission time and time and time again. And I'm not saying they should, you know, to the letter, implement what I think should be done, but they should at least demonstrate that there was a cognizance about the submission. I just find that frustrating. And I remember, for example, when Leitrim started a campaign to avoid the split between Roscommon South Leitrim and the other constituency, which was Sligo North. Yeah,
Sligo North Leitrim.
And it divided in two. And the people of Leitrim had a very good petition and campaign, and campaigned and emailed all members of the Oireachtas to change that. And it was, to me, a very serious breach of a county. For a county the size of Leitrim to be thrown in with two different other counties, Roscommon and Sligo, was very, very unfair on them. And I said to myself, well, maybe the Commission now will play due diligence and kind of take on board those views. And they didn't do that. And like, there are still large sections, as you'll be aware, Jim, down through your years, there are large sections around Dunmanway town that are in Cork North West. And like, if people are using a town, you know, for schools or markets or church services, whatever the case might be, I think they need to kind of reflect that in terms of how they look at particular submissions. And like, my issue is a very minor grievance in comparison to a breach of a county boundary. I think they should avoid them at all costs. But on that electoral register one, before I call you, Noel, finally.
Could I make a comment on understanding our own local area, and we don't want it all to be sent to West Cork or anything like that. But traditionally, since the Boundary Commission has produced a report, there's absolutely no change. You just take it as it's delivered, and that's been the practice and the precedent, and there's maybe merit in that. The issue has to be raised, I think, as to whether there's a case for more consultation in advance. I know you can make a submission, which sort of, I'd say some people make submissions think it just disappears into the ether. Maybe there should be public hearings or hearings before some kind of a committee system, or I haven't worked out this idea, but maybe there should be an opportunity for somebody to make an oral presentation and as it were to argue out their case in that fashion. I don't think there's any such procedure at the moment.
No,
I'd be inclined to kind of press that view that that's maybe the way forward.
No, just before you come in, all right, I think there's a view emanating here from the last number of weeks that the Commission should be established, and it kind of mirrors what you're saying yourself and reflects your own contributions. Like, get it up and running, and give it a very realistic time frame, and give it terms of reference, and give it resources, so on and so forth, and then over time develop how they kind of feel their way around the actual issues. And on that electoral register, what do you think, no, I would say, in terms of your thinking, is what's the biggest challenge about that role, about changing, number one, the nature in which the register is done? So if you're bringing that responsibility from 31 local authorities into one commission, what's the biggest challenge around that? Trying to kind of, to maintain some of the skill sets already there on those authorities.
I hope it's reflected in my own submission, and my own approach will be exactly as you suggest. The Electoral Commission's first function will be almost to bang the heads together of the 31 local authorities and say, compare notes and databases first, folks. Then take those databases, folks, and compare them with what the revenue or social welfare have. And that actually, sometimes it's actually just a database management and integration process, that if you had a national body, it would have the power to insist that that be done. Simultaneously, as a national body, it would run a national campaign in the autumn to encourage those voting for the first time or who have moved area to register at that stage, so you're not caught up in the supplementary process. And I think that those two steps of their own could deliver a marked improvement and give both the Commission confidence, the Electoral Commission confidence that it can take on the broader task, if that's appropriate, and the public confidence, and you as politicians confidence, that somebody is now responsible. And this comes back, a lot of merit in what former Deputy O'Keefe said a moment ago, is that one of the difficulties I see as shall we say, an amateur expert in this area, is the lack of expertise about the system. The best expertise about the system is in this House, and the politicians themselves. But unfortunately, ye by their very nature are biased about it. That's fair enough. You can't have the players being the ref as well. But what I'm saying is there isn't actually a collection of people whose job it is, whose life work it is day to day, to analyse and see and tweak the machine and get under the bonnet and say, this could be done different, or to look at how it's run in Australia or New Zealand or comparable places and look at what's best. I mean, this is where I emphasise, I think technology can be a great help to the electoral process. And this brings me back to Deputy Coonan's question about compulsory voting. I think, I wouldn't go as far as compulsory voting, but there's a hell of a lot more that could be done to encourage voting. So, for example, one of the campaigning groups for the marriage referendum that I was involved in ran this campaign called Get Me to the Vote on Time. All the research shows, from the referendums in particular, that about a third to 40% of people didn't vote on the day because it wasn't practically convenient for them. Now, sometimes that's an excuse, sometimes it's real. They hadn't thought through, where is my polling station? What hour is the polling station open at? Will I do it before I go to work, or because it's Friday after I go for pints, which can't be done? And one of the campaigns that was run was that the Friday before the 22nd of May, which was polling day, said, well, think about next Friday. Where are you next Friday? What's involved? Again, my point is that an independent electoral commission that was proactively engaged in communicating with the public would do that, see that as part of its function, so as to encourage voting rather than necessarily make it compulsory. And I think text message reminders were used, not because the text message reminded you to go to vote, but by going online and registering for the text, get a text the following Friday at the time you said you might vote. It forced you to think about the following Friday, and where am I going? Oh God, actually I have a stag party that night, I better go do it on Friday morning. So it's all about best modern practice and technologies by somebody who has the remit and collected the expertise to make elections work better.
Good point. One of the points Dr. Teresa Reedy made here 2 weeks ago, I asked, like, in their opinion, because their expertise, their research expertise is around electoral commissions, what should we aspire to hear? And she said the Canadian model on the New Zealand scale, and it really was, I think, worthy of at least thought. Listen, Jimmy, can I thank you most sincerely for taking time out of your busy schedules to come in and to help us deliberate. Deputy Fleming, Mr. O'Keefe and Mr. Whelan, you're free to go. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, well, the members wait on for about 2 minutes. We have a bit of private correspondence. Only take a couple of minutes. One is fine, 2 is fine.